Picture a factory floor. Seattle, 1943. The sound hits you first, not the roar of engines, not yet. It's the rhythm of rivets, thousands of them, a percussion section playing the same note over and over, each strike driving another piece of aluminum into place. Pneumatic hammers punch out a tempo, metal screams against metal. Somewhere in the distance, a welder's torch hisses. The air tastes like machine oil and hot aluminum. Dust floats through beams of light, cutting down from skylights 40 feet up. Under those lights, something impossible takes shape. She's silver, massive, wings stretching 103 feet from tip to tip, longer than the Wright brothers' entire first flight. 4 engines hang from those wings like steel flowers. Each one weighs more than a car. The fuselage curves away into the factory haze, 74 feet of riveted panels and gun turrets and promise. This is a B-17, a flying fortress. And right now, at this very moment, she's costing the American taxpayer $212,632. $212,632. Let that number sit for a second. In 1943, you could buy a nice house for $3,000. A new Ford cost about $800. A year's salary for a factory worker came to around $2,000. This airplane? She costs as much as 106 houses, or 266 cars, or a century of wages for the average American. But here's what I want you to understand. That number, it's a lie. Not an intentional one. The accountants wrote it down honestly. Boeing submitted their invoices. The Army paid them. $212,632 per airplane. Clean, simple, filed away in ledgers that nobody reads anymore. But that's just the price tag. The price of what rolled out the factory door, engines warm, fuel tanks empty, ready to fly. The actual cost? The real cost? That's a different story. That's what we're here to figure out. Because to understand what one B-17 truly cost, you have to go back. Back before the rivets, before the assembly lines, before Pearl Harbor even. You have to start in 1934, in a cramped office in Seattle, where a soft-spoken engineer named Ed Wells is staring at a blank page and thinking about the future of war. Let's go back to the beginning. The Great Depression is 5 years old and still squeezing. 1 in 4 Americans is out of work. People stand in bread lines in cities where airplanes once seemed like science fiction. But in a few places, the future is still being built. One of those places is Boeing Airplane Company. Claire Egdvedt runs the company. He's one of those men who seems carved from wood rather than born from flesh. Square jaw, direct eyes, an engineer who climbed to the executive chair but never forgot how to read a blueprint. He looks at airplanes the way some men look at cathedrals, with reverence, with ambition. His chief engineer is Ed Wells, 33 years old in 1934. Quiet, methodical, the kind of mind that solves problems other people don't even see yet. Wells doesn't talk much. When he does, people listen. Together, these 2 men are going to bet everything. The U.S. Army Air Corps issues a request. They want a multi-engine bomber, something that can carry a meaningful bomb load farther and faster than anything currently in the inventory. The official requirement is specific. Twin engines, top speed 200 miles per hour, range of 2,000 miles. Most companies read that and start designing twin-engine planes. Egdvedt and Wells read it differently. Why twin? Wells asks one afternoon. The story goes that he and Egdvedt are walking through the factory floor, watching workers assemble Model 247s, commercial planes, reliable but unremarkable. The requirement doesn't say twin. It says multi-engine. Multi means the reduction of 4 is more than 1. Egtvit stops walking. You can imagine the moment, the noise of the factory around them, the smell of dope and varnish from the fabric-covered wings nearby. And in that moment, they make the decision that will change everything. They're going to build a 4-engine bomber. Boeing doesn't have a contract for this. The Army hasn't asked for 4 engines. Boeing is going to spend its own money, a lot of money, money the company doesn't really have. Remember, this is 1934. The Depression isn't over. Cash is scarce. Boeing's board of directors thinks this is insane. But Egtvit and Wells move forward anyway. The project gets a designation, Model 299. Development begins in June 1934. Wells leads the design team. They work in a small room on the second floor of Boeing's plant. 12 engineers, drawing boards, slide rules, coffee, mountains of calculations done by hand. Think about that. No computers, no simulation software. Every stress calculation, every aerodynamic profile, every structural load, all worked out with pencils and paper and minds that refuse to quit. They're inventing the future with nothing but brain power and belief. The design comes together through late 1934 and early 1935. 4 Wright Cyclone engines, all metal construction, retractable landing gear, a wingspan that makes people nervous, defensive armament, machine guns in multiple positions, because this bomber is going to fly into harm's way and needs to fight back. The Army has budgeted somewhere around $14,000 per airplane for whatever design wins the competition. Boeing is about to spend almost 20 times that amount just to build the prototype. $275,000. $275,000 of Boeing's money. Money they don't have lying around. Money borrowed against the company's future. If this airplane fails, Boeing might not survive. So you see, before we even talk about production costs, before the first rivet goes into the first production model, we're already deep in the red. Development costs, research, engineering hours, the thousands of calculations that have to happen before you can cut the first piece of aluminum. This is the invisible cost, the one that doesn't show up on the price tag. July 28, 1935, Boeing Field, Seattle. The Model 299 sits on the tarmac, silver skin gleaming in the morning light. Test pilot Les Tower is at the controls, Boeing's chief test pilot, a careful man with steady hands. The engines start with coughs that become roars, all 4. The sound is enormous. People on the ground feel it in their chests. Tower releases the brakes. The airplane accelerates. Faster, faster. The tail comes up, and then, almost impossibly, the wheels lift off the ground. This massive thing, this 4-engine aluminum cathedral, climbs into the sky. Someone from the Seattle Times is there, a reporter, watching with his mouth open. He writes down a phrase that will stick: Flying Fortress. The name becomes official. The test flight is perfect. Tower lands, shuts down, climbs out grinning. Boeing has done it, built something remarkable, something ahead of its time. Then 2 months later, October 30th, everything goes wrong. The Army competition is underway at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The Model 299 is performing beautifully, faster than the competition, higher ceiling, longer range. It's clear this airplane is something special. October 30th, final evaluation flight. Les Tower is pilot again. There's an Army Air Corps pilot in the right seat, a Major Ployer Hill. They're going to put the airplane through its paces one last time before the Army makes its decision. The takeoff starts normally, engines at full power. The Fortress rolls down the runway. Except something's wrong. The tail won't come up. The nose stays pointed high, too high. Tower pulls back on the throttles, but the airplane is already airborne, climbing steeply, dangerously steeply. Someone left the gust locks engaged. The gust locks, mechanical devices that hold the control surfaces in place when the airplane is parked on the ground. They're supposed to be released before flight. In the Model 299, there are so many new systems, so many pre-flight checks, that Tower and Hill missed one. One simple thing. The airplane can't be controlled. It stalls. 300 feet up, the flying fortress falls out of the sky. The crash is catastrophic. Fire erupts immediately. Tower dies from his injuries 2 days later. Major Hill dies at the scene. 2 others survive, but badly burned. Boeing's dream burns on a runway in Ohio. The Army cancels the competition. They award the contract to Douglas for their twin-engine B-18, the safe choice, the predictable choice. Boeing nets nothing. $275,000 of development money, gone. The prototype destroyed, 2 men dead. The company is devastated. But here's where the story gets interesting. Some people at the Air Corps don't forget what they saw before the crash. That airplane was special, faster, higher, farther than anything else flying. A few officers convinced the Army to place a small order, not for bombers, for service test aircraft. 13 airplanes designated Y-1B-17. It's not the production contract Boeing hoped for, but it's something, a lifeline. Each Y-1B-17 cost the Army $99,620. Call it $100,000. Boeing builds them at a loss. The company is still paying off the development costs, still trying to prove the concept works. The 13 service test aircraft go to the 2nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field, Virginia. January 1937. The crews fall in love immediately. One of those early pilots is a young officer named Curtis LeMay. Hard-eyed, brilliant, tough as bridge cable. LeMay looks at the B-17 and sees the future of strategic air power. These early fortresses prove the concept. They fly long-range navigation exercises, intercept exercises. The Air Corps starts to understand what they have. But there's a problem, a big one. Politics. The Navy doesn't want the Army flying long-range bombers. That's the Navy's job, they argue, projecting power over water. The admirals fight the B-17 program tooth and nail. Congress is skeptical, too. These airplanes are expensive. Why do we need them? It takes vision to see what's coming. In 1937, most Americans don't want to think about another war. Europe's problems are Europe's problems. The Pacific is an ocean away. But a few people see the storm gathering. The Air Corps keeps ordering B-17s in small batches. 39 B-17Bs in 1939. 80 B-17Cs and Ds in 1940. Each order is a fight. Each appropriation is contested. Then Pearl Harbor happens. December 7th, 1941. Everything changes in a morning. Suddenly, the question isn't whether America needs long-range bombers. The question is, how fast can you build them? The answer is, not fast enough. When the United States enters World War II, the Army Air Forces has fewer than 200 B-17s total. Most are the early models, B, C, and D variants, lightly armed, short on range, not ready for what's coming. Boeing goes into overdrive. The B-17E model is already in development. This is the version that will fight the war. Redesigned tail, more guns, bigger bomb bay, everything the crews have been asking for. Production orders flood in. Thousands of airplanes. Build them now, build them fast. But here's the thing about building airplanes. It's not like building cars. Every B-17 requires 36,550 separate parts. 36,550. Each one manufactured to precise specifications. Each one has to fit perfectly with every other part. The airframe alone uses 48,800 pounds of aluminum, 24 tons. That aluminum has to be rolled, stamped, cut, and formed into 14,000 separate pieces: wings, fuselage sections, control surfaces, ribs and stringers and longerons. Then there's the engines. 4 Wright 1820 Cyclone radial engines. Each engine contains 14,000 parts, each weighs 1,200 pounds, each costs $36,000. Do the math. $144,000 just for engines. 2/3 of the airplane's total price tag is in the power plants. The propellers are Hamilton Standard constant speed units, $2,400 each, times 4, nearly $10,000 just to turn the engines into thrust. 13 machine guns. Each Browning M2 .5 caliber costs $667. The gun turrets are marvels of engineering, rotating, electrically powered, synchronized to avoid shooting off the airplane's own tail. The top turret alone costs $9,000. Radios, navigation equipment, bomb sights. The Norden bomb sight is a mechanical computer so secret that bombardiers are sworn to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Each bomb sight costs $14,000. That's more than a house for a gyroscope-stabilized calculating machine. Landing gear that has to survive controlled crashes onto damaged runways. Hydraulic systems, oxygen systems for high-altitude flight, heating systems so the crew doesn't freeze to death at 25,000 feet. Each system is complex. Each costs money. Now multiply all of this by 12,731. That's how many B-17s will be built before the war ends. Boeing can't build them all alone. The company's Seattle plant is maxed out. The production rate in 1942 hits 1 airplane every 2 days. Not fast enough. The Army sets up additional production lines. Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, California, Lockheed Vega in Burbank. 3 companies building the same airplane to the same blueprints. The logistics are staggering. Aluminum comes from smelters in the Pacific Northwest, powered by dams on the Columbia River. Those dams are construction projects in themselves. Grand Coulee Dam, Bonneville Dam, built specifically to provide electricity for aluminum production. So when you ask what a B-17 costs, do you count a fraction of Grand Coulee Dam? The engines come from Wright Aeronautical in New Jersey. Raw materials arrive by train. Iron ore from Minnesota, copper from Arizona, rubber for hoses and seals, natural rubber, because synthetic hasn't been perfected yet, comes from plantations in Southeast Asia until Japan cuts off the supply. Then it comes from emergency stockpiles and recycling drives. Boy Scouts collect scrap rubber in American towns. That rubber ends up in B-17s. The workforce explodes. Boeing employs 4,000 people in 1940. By 1944, it's 45,000. Most have never built an airplane before. Many are women. Rosie the Riveter isn't just propaganda, she's real. She's driving rivets into B-17 skins on factory floors in Seattle and Long Beach. Training these workers costs money. Building the factories costs money. The Douglas plant in Long Beach requires 1.3 million square feet of floor space. You could fit 30 football fields inside. Construction costs for that facility alone run into millions. The Army pays for it. The taxpayers pay for it. At peak production in 1944, the 3 plants combined are producing 360 B-17s per month. That's 12 per day, 1 every 2 hours. A flying fortress every 120 minutes, rolling off production lines on opposite sides of the continent. Each one costs $212,632 in direct production costs. But remember, that's just the flyaway cost. There's more, much more. Every B-17 needs spare parts. Engines wear out, landing gear fails, battle damage has to be repaired. The Army maintains supply depots stocked with thousands of replacement components, entire warehouses full of propellers and turbochargers and gun barrels. Those costs don't show up on the airplane's price tag. Training costs. Each B-17 crew is 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. Training a single crew costs $250,000, $250,000, more than the airplane costs. And crews get killed. You train another crew, and another. Over the course of the war, the training costs exceed the aircraft costs. Fuel. Each B-17 burns 200 gallons of aviation gasoline per hour. A mission to Berlin and back takes 9 hours. That's 1,800 gallons, times 12 bombers in a squadron, times dozens of squadrons flying every day. The infrastructure costs are invisible, but enormous. Airfields in England, hard stands for parking, maintenance hangars, control towers, barracks for the crews, mess halls, hospitals for the wounded. Each airfield costs millions to build. 8th Air Force in England operates from dozens of bases. Each one requires water, electricity, sewage, roads. Small cities built from scratch in the English countryside. Who pays for that? You do, the taxpayers. It's all part of the cost. Let's add it up. $212,632 per airplane in direct production costs, times 12,731 B-17s built. That's $2.7 billion. $2,700,000,000. But that's just the start. Add the development costs, the $275,000 Boeing gambled on the prototype, the years of refinement, the testing, the engineering modifications. Conservatively, another $100 million. Add the production facilities, 3 major assembly plants plus dozens of component manufacturers. Call it $500 million for facilities and tooling. Add the spare parts, the depot maintenance, the field repairs, easily another $1 billion. Add the training, the crews, the instructors, the training aircraft, another $1 billion. Add the fuel, millions upon millions of gallons of aviation gasoline, several $100 million. Add the infrastructure, the airfields, the support facilities, billions more. You start to see the real number. Conservative estimate, $7 billion to $8 billion. That's the actual all-in cost of the B-17 program, maybe more. In 1945 dollars, that's money that could build 2,000 schools, or 50 hospitals, or feed millions of people for years. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, try $120 billion. $120 billion. That's the real price tag. Now here's the question. Was it worth it? The B-17 dropped 640,000 tons of bombs on Europe, more than any other aircraft in the American arsenal. Those bombs destroyed factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and airfields. They crippled Germany's ability to make war, but they also killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, turned cities into rubble, created firestorms that burned for days. 4,750 B-17s were lost in combat. Another 2,000 were damaged beyond repair. That's half the total production destroyed. Each lost airplane took its crew with it. 10 men per bomber. 47,500 men killed in B-17s. Young men, 20 years old, most of them. Farm kids from Iowa, factory workers' sons from Detroit, college students from California. Each one cost $250,000 to train. Each one was irreplaceable. The survivors came home changed, some missing limbs, others missing pieces of their minds. PTSD wasn't a diagnosis yet, but the symptoms were real enough. Men who jumped at thunder, who couldn't sleep, who saw friends burn and couldn't forget. You can't put a price on that. But the accountants tried. The Army calculated the total cost of the air war in Europe: planes, crews, bases, bombs, fuel, everything. $45 billion in 1945 dollars. And the B-17 was just one airplane type. Today, we build bombers that cost $2 billion each. A single B-2 Spirit stealth bomber carries a price tag that would have bought nearly 10,000 B-17s. We think that's expensive, and it is. But here's what we forget. The relative cost in 1943 was just as crushing. $212,632 doesn't sound like much now, but in 1943, that was a fortune. That was everything. The United States spent 40% of its entire gross domestic product on the war. 40%. Nearly half of everything America produced went to building weapons and feeding armies. You want to understand what that means? Imagine the government taking half of everything, half your income, half of every factory's output, half of every farm's harvest for 4 years. That's what it took. That's what it cost. The B-17 was just one line item in a budget that defied comprehension. But it's a useful lens for understanding the scale, because when you break down what one airplane actually costs, really costs, all in, you start to understand the weight of it. Every time a B-17 went down over Germany, $212,632 fell out of the sky in a smoking spiral, plus 10 lives, plus the training costs, plus the years of experience those men represented. By that accounting, every mission was fantastically expensive. But here's the other side. Those missions worked. Strategic bombing didn't win the war alone, but it helped. The oil refineries destroyed by B-17s meant German tanks ran out of fuel. The factories destroyed meant fewer aircraft to contest the skies over Normandy. The price was terrible, but the alternative was worse. That's the calculus of war. You don't measure success in dollars saved. You measure it in the war ending versus the war continuing. And in 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, when the camps were liberated and the killing stopped, the cost became justifiable. Not cheap, not easy, but justifiable. The people who built those B-17s knew this. The riveter driving aluminum in Seattle, the engineer calculating stress loads in Burbank, the woman painting identification numbers on tail fins in Long Beach. They knew every airplane mattered. Every rivet had to hold. Every system had to work. Because men were going to fly these airplanes into the teeth of the worst war in human history. And those men needed machines they could trust. The B-17 earned that trust. She wasn't perfect. Early models had problems. Crews complained about inadequate oxygen systems, about guns that froze at altitude, about temperatures cold enough to give you frostbite through heated flight suits. But Boeing listened. They fixed things. Each model variant incorporated lessons learned from combat. By the time the B-17G came along, the final production variant, the Flying Fortress was as good as a piston-engine bomber could be. Crews painted names on their noses: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, 909. Each bomber became personal, a home in the sky, a mobile fortress where 10 men lived and fought and sometimes died together. Those names mattered. They turned statistics into stories, turned $212,632 worth of aluminum and engines into something with a soul. And that's the paradox. You can add up every dollar, account for every rivet, calculate the total to the penny, but you can't really measure what it meant. Today, only a handful of B-17s still fly, maybe 15 worldwide. Museum pieces, warbirds maintained by dedicated crews who keep the engines running and the aluminum polished. You can take rides in some of them, climb through the narrow waist section, feel the wind whistling through the gun windows. Imagine doing this at 25,000 feet with fighters coming at you and flak bursting in black flowers all around. It costs $475 for a ride, 15 minutes, That's a better deal than the original price. The last B-17 rolled off the assembly line at Lockheed Vegas plant on July 29, 1945, 6 weeks after Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Japan was weeks from surrender. Boeing didn't build anymore. Douglas didn't build anymore. The production line shut down. The workers went home. The factories retooled for peacetime production. By 1946, most of the B-17 fleet was being cut up for scrap. Thousands of airplanes that cost $212,632 each sold for pennies on the pound, melted down, turned into car bodies and washing machines and bridges. The aluminum recycled, the engines salvaged, the story largely forgotten. But not entirely, because the B-17 changed things. It proved that strategic bombing could work, that you could build airplanes in numbers that would have seemed impossible before, that a nation could mobilize its industrial capacity and turn raw materials into air power. Every bomber that came after, the B-29, the B-52, the B-1, the B-2, owes something to the flying fortress. The lessons learned over Germany informed every subsequent design. The cost of modern bombers seems astronomical, and it is. A B-21 Raider, the newest stealth bomber, costs close to $700 million per airplane. But adjusted for inflation and capability, maybe it's not so different. Maybe we're still making the same calculation our grandparents made. How much do you spend to keep your nation safe? The answer is, whatever it takes. The B-17 cost $212,632 in flyaway costs. It cost billions when you account for everything. It cost 47,500 lives. And it helped win a war. That's the price. That's what victory cost. You can argue whether it was worth it. People have argued for 80 years. But you can't argue with the result. The war ended. The darkness lifted. And somewhere in that calculus of metal and money and blood, the price became acceptable. Not good, not happy, just acceptable. So when you see one of those silver bombers at an air show, engines coughing to life, propellers windmilling, that distinctive sound of 4 radial engines pulling her into the sky, remember what you're looking at. You're looking at $212,632 worth of aluminum and engines and hope. You're looking at what your grandparents paid for, with their taxes, with their work, sometimes with their lives. You're looking at the price of victory. And that's a price that can't really be calculated, only paid. The sound of those engines fades into memory now. The men who flew them are mostly gone. The factories are silent. The accounting ledgers filed away in archives nobody reads. But the lessons remain. War is expensive. In money, in lives, in everything that matters. The B-17 Flying Fortress taught us that. $212,632, plus everything else.